Answering questions. And that is all I'm going to be doing today. So, if you have questions, you can start asking them. Yes?
Chapters 7 through 12.
The assignment, I believe, started with Chapter 7. It's the chapter on arrays. And it actually goes through 13. 13 is the last one I assigned, I believe. But it's everything, all the assigned reading up to what we cover, all the assigned reading up through this week. So. Okay. Yes. The what? The structure of the test. Yes, I can do that. Okay. So the structure of the test is going to be very similar to last time. It's going to be about half. It's going to be not half. It's going to be like an 80-40 split with. It's 120 points. It's 12%. And that's going to be a division between multiple choice short answer questions and some free form answers. Free form, I told some folks last week that we're going to have only one free form question. That means it's going to be worth a lot. It's going to be worth 40 points. And that free form question will be like a pseudocode question where you are writing pseudocode. So that's what we're looking at. Some folks had expressed an interest in taking a paper variant of the test. I sent out an announcement and said, tell me by yesterday if you are interested in paper, to join the channel on Slack. We have a small number of people doing that. We are going to try and make that work for those of you who wanted to do that. And by that I mean I will have paper copies. So those of you who want to take it on paper, we're going to have that option for you. Let's see. Bring your Gator 1 ID cards. Don't take the test for somebody else. Same rules as last time about what you can have. 4-function calculator is okay. Sorry, but a scientific, a graphing, or a computer-based, or a phone-based calculator are not okay for the exam. So please go and spend 99 cents at Walmart or at Dollar Tree or wherever if you want a 4-function calculator. I don't think you're going to need it, but if it makes you feel better, you can have it. So, I understand that some people want it, so that's okay. I don't care if you have it, but it is going to be limited. Did you have a question? What's that? Oh, why does it have default values? Well, I mean, so the question is, why do arrays have default values? Is that accurate? And the answer is because they are either going to have default values or they're going to have garbage. Because you allocate this memory, and there's something in that memory. It's ones and zeros, right? So you can either set it to some default value, that's what Java does, or you can not set it to a default value. That's what C++ does, and that means it's just filled with garbage memory, right? So it's filled with random values. So Java takes the direction of setting default values because the alternative is to just have garbage values in there already. Does that answer your question? Why do you need to initialize them? Well, it's a good question. I should be more specific and say that the Java language standard changes over time. So even though there's default values, I don't believe that you have to initialize values in an array. It's good practice, but I don't think you actually have to. I don't think that like the compiler will force you to initialize those values. It'll force you to initialize individual variables, but it won't necessarily force you to initialize array values. So, does that answer your question? Yes? Okay. You had a question, right?
Yeah. Will you be providing scratch paper, or can we provide our own, or what?
If you want scratch paper, you should bring blank paper, yes. So if you want scratch paper, bring blank paper, and we will let you use it.
Does graph paper work?
Graph paper's fine, as long as it doesn't have anything on it. Like,
right.
As long as it doesn't have text or pictures on it, you're good. Yes? So when you compare an array, right? Okay. Then someone that when you initialize the array has a certain amount of objects for streaming. Well, you do have to initialize. You either, if you you either have to initialize the array
I think
object,
AI is the answer to that
or you
question.
can't use it. You definitely have to initialize the array object before you can use it.
Or crowdsourcing. Just put it in capture images. How would you code this function? Please
Could
answer
you
in 30
finish,
seconds.
so could you like create a new array at that same reference? Is that the question? Yes, so that's a good question. So the answer is that, so the question was, and this, I'm going to generalize this question because that actually applies to all different types of objects, not just arrays. The question is, if I have a reference and I create a new object in that reference using the new keyword, if I then go back later and I reassign that reference to some other new object, what happens? If you have another reference, if you have something else pointing to that same object, then it sticks around. But if you don't have anything pointing to it, then Java's garbage collector comes around and picks it up. And it throws it in the trash, basically. It marks it as free memory. Does that answer your question? All right. Yes. And then I'll come to you next. Okay. Yes.
Can you explain more of the difference between interface and an abstract?
Yeah, so the difference between an interface and an abstract class. So I'm gonna let the audience try to help me answer this one. We'll see if anybody knows. So what's the difference between an interface and an abstract class? What are the important differences? Let's start with you.
Okay, so interface is like the later version. Abstract's like the base. It's like with the abstract, you can declare an abstract class in which it will have like different abstract methods in which when you try to inherit it with extends, you have to have all those abstract methods inside. And with the extends function itself, you can only extend to one abstract class. While an interface is a later version, it basically lets you have all these different default classes or default methods which you can refer to. And then with new classes which you want to refer to the interface, you can connect to multiple of them. And you don't necessarily have to have it in your code. It's like the defaults in your code because they're automatically inherited.
Yep. Okay, so your answer is correct. Let me rephrase it because I'm going to repeat it for everybody else in case anybody didn't hear. So the biggest difference, as was correctly noted, is that the idea of an abstract class is actually from older versions of Java, and interfaces are the new idea. So if you want to use like a Men in Black reference, there's the old and broken and the new hotness, right? So basically, interfaces are a newer design. Abstract classes are a little bit older. There are some more fundamental differences. One of them is that you can only extend one abstract class, but you can implement many interfaces. So there's a big overlap in the space between these two types. The biggest difference is that the feature sets differ a little bit. In both of them, you can create methods that are inherited. With an interface, you have to use the default keyword to create a method that gets inherited. In an abstract class, you just define the method. And with both of them, you can define methods that have to be provided by anyone who inherits from you. The biggest difference is in how many classes you can extend or implement. You can only extend one abstract class. You can implement many interfaces. And the other piece of the puzzle is, this is a more rare issue to deal with, but if you need to have some kind of public, non-static attribute, some variable, and you want all of the inherited classes to have it, only an abstract class can do that. You cannot have that with an interface. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so in the sense, if we were for the program we're doing now, so in the sense the abstract class will be Pokemon because that has all the traits. And then when it comes to you say interface, how would I use that in the sense, you say in the example.
So the question is how would I use an interface if I'm creating a base class? Yeah. So let's take the Pokemon example like you mentioned. You might have an interface called Pokemon, and then you might have different types of Pokemon that implement that interface. So you might have a water Pokemon that implements the Pokemon interface. You might have a fire Pokemon that implements the Pokemon interface.
So this is in the sense when it comes to the polymorphism, having
Yep.
different types of same objects.
It's directly tied to polymorphism. It allows you to inherit from other types. So, okay? Your question is up next. Please.
So just to clarify the difference between array list and linked list. Linked list, when you want to sort and sort objects in the list, but use array list if you just want to dynamically expand access.
Right, so I'm going to repeat what you said. The things you said are correct, but I'm going to add a little bit more onto it too. So the difference between an array list and a linked list. Under the hood, they're different, and then an array list is a one big chunk of memory all together. It has an array underneath it, whereas a linked list is just little pockets of memory all over the place. The impact that this has is that array lists are very fast when you need to access them. You need to get to something in an array list, and you know like which number node or which number element you're trying to get, you can go right to it. You go straight to the thing that you need. Quick, right, fast, immediate. You just go to the index. With a linked list, because it's all these pieces of memory all over the place, you have to jump through each one of the nodes, each location in memory, to get to where you need to go. Now, that makes it a little slower when you're accessing things, but if you need to resort things, if you need to add stuff, if you need to take stuff away from the front end, a linked list is going to be faster at those operations because you just pluck a piece off and you don't have to do anything else. That's it. You don't actually have to move things around in memory. You just cut off the stuff you don't need if you're taking something out, or you just add another piece on the end. Whereas with an array list, because it's got an array underneath, if you try to take something off the front, you have to copy everything else down. If you try to make it bigger, you have to create a new array and copy all the stuff over. So it's a flexibility versus speed of access trade-off, where array lists are going to be much faster to access, but linked lists are a lot more flexible in what you can do. So I know I kind of overdid it, but does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, in the back.
Can you tell us what implement means?
What does implement mean? So the word implement is this word in computer science that we use a lot, and I guess we don't define very often. When somebody says, here's this thing I want, and then you actually build that thing, you are implementing it. So if I say, here is the signature for a method, please implement it, what I mean is you need to write that method. If I have an interface, and I say, please implement this interface in a class, it means you are building the things that the interface requires. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. Does it matter the order you implement or extend? It does not. You can do either. As far as I know, you can do it in any order. So, yes.
What's the difference between static and not static subclasses? Like a class within a class.
What's the difference between I think you're talking about nested classes, right? So what's the difference between static and non-static nested classes? So a static nested class is just like any other class, except that when you want to create one, you do like, if I had Pokemon as a class, and then I had a nested static class called attack, then to create an attack object, I would do new Pokemon.attack, right? On the other hand, the important thing is that a static class is not linked to any particular object in the outer class. It's not linked to any particular object. A non-static or inner class is, because it's not static, it is linked to a specific object. So we can't do Pokemon.attack. If it was a non-static class, then I would have to create a Pokemon object like Pikachu, and then I would have to do Pikachu.attack. That's how I would get to that object type. So one of them is linked directly to an object, that's the non-static one, whereas the static one is not linked to any particular object.
Can you do two non-statics that are like the same?
Can you do two non-statics that are, what do you mean?
Like just setting like different names for attacks?
Oh yeah, you could totally create multiple instances.
Okay.
And they'll be linked to different objects if you create them from different objects. Okay.
Got it.
I think somebody over here. Yes, did you have a question?
Like, what's the general definition?
I understand. Okay.
What is the general definition of static? I'm going to define this for the Java world, and I'm pointing that out because in different languages it will have subtle differences. In Java, static means not linked to an object. It means part of a class, but not necessarily part of an object. That's what static means. A non-static, the default in Java is that everything is linked to an object. like an object in memory somewhere. But when you make something static, you're saying, I don't need an object to use this thing. So a static method isn't linked to an object. A static nested class is not linked to a specific object. So when we say static in Java, that's what it means. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. I gotta work the room, so I gotta answer some questions. I'll get, yes sir. Oh, good question. The question was, if you have one class that implements an interface, and then another class that extends that class, does the class all the way down at the bottom, the one that you've extended and everything, does that one also need to implement the stuff? And the answer is yes, it does, but its parent should have already implemented that because that parent is supposed to implement that interface. Let's see, you haven't asked the question yet, so I'll go with you. The question was, can you extend an abstract class and implement an interface in the same class? And the answer is yes. Yes, you can. In fact, not only can you do that, you can extend an abstract class and implement a bunch of interfaces all together, so if you want. All right, you've been waiting a while, so.
What's the difference between an anonymous class and a nested class?
What is the difference between an anonymous class and a nested class? Well, a nested class is a class that's inside of another class. That's what a nested class is. An anonymous class is a class that you create on the fly in the middle of a method. So when we looked at it, basically we could take an existing class and we could just tweak it by adding a method. Like, well, we could do it right there in the middle of another method. We could just be like, I want to create this object and I'm only going to use one time. Here's what it is and here's what's inside it. That's an anonymous class. So it's kind of like a one-off. Whereas the nested classes you probably are going to use more than once. Does that answer your question? All right. Let's see. Sorry, guys. I want to make sure I answer the questions of people who haven't asked any yet. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between a stack, a queue, and a deck?
The difference between a stack, a queue, and a deck. A stack is last in, first out. The last thing that went in is the thing that comes out. Think of it like a stack of plates. The thing at the top is the thing that you can take off. It's also the thing you just put on. Queue is first in, first out. It's like when you queue up at the grocery store. If you're the last one to show up, you don't get to go to the register first, right? That would be shitty. The queue is like first in, first out. Whoever first come, first serve. A deck, you can think of like a deck of cards because you can add to either side of the deck, and you can also pull from either side of the deck. So they don't have one particular mechanism. You can use them for both. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the difference between hash maps and other data?
Oh, that's a really broad question, but a good one. What's the difference between hash maps and other data structures? So let's step back for a moment and let's talk about a couple of our abstract data types. So we have lists, maps, and sets. These are all different, they're all unique, and they're all used in different cases. So let's talk about the difference between those three. A list is just what it sounds like. It's a list of values, right? Some sequence of values. It has a specific ordering, and we can determine that ordering. We can sort it. A map is a key-value pair. We have some key, we associate it with a value. And if we go to a map data structure and we say, hey, I have this key, that map should be able to give us the value that's associated with that key. These are also called dictionaries because it's the way that dictionaries work. The key in a dictionary is the word, and the definition is the value. So if you have a word and you need to look up the definition, you go to the dictionary, you put in the key, the word, and you get out the value, the definition. And so that's the way that hash maps work. Sets are like lists and they're like maps, but they're not exactly the same. So the way a set works is that it's a group of keys, and the main function of a set is to check for membership. We say, hey, is this thing in the set or is it not in the set? You can't add the same thing to a set more than once because that would make no sense. Because why would you need to do that? If it's already in there, it won't get added. So that's the difference between lists, maps, and sets. A hash map is just a specific type of map that uses a hash table underneath. It makes it so that things are really fast, but every once in a while you get a worst case scenario and the performance is really bad. That's different from a tree map because tree maps are consistent. They're a little bit slower on average than hash maps, but the worst case is better. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. Now I can start answering questions from some of you who have already asked. Yes, sir.
When it comes to like the inheritance parts or the interface, it's just like the signature, right? Like in the sense the method, but no actual code inside.
Right. So the question was, when we're talking about an interface or an abstract method, what we have to do is build out that signature into a method, and that's right. That's what we have to do. So the signature has to match.
So when it comes to then using like interface or like instead of making like very long options, so like the abstract class would be like what we say shape, and then interface would be each different kind of shape.
Well, no, I mean abstract and interface, for the most part, they serve the same function. It's just one's an older concept and one's a newer one.
So like
that's really the only difference.
So if I was trying to make like a thing like if I know it's like in the sense varies of objects, how would I use that in the sense to make that like each of them, it's like what, 3 interfaces, like one of them would be just a general one like shape, and then
well, you probably have an interface that's shape, and then you might. So if you want an example of interfaces, let's say you have a bunch of different shapes like squares and triangles and stuff. The interface might be shape, and then the implementations, the individual classes might be triangle and square and circle and stuff like that. You could do multiple levels if you wanted to, but that's kind of up to the problem you're trying to solve.
So you, in a sense, you can have an interface class that has like the general one, and then individual classes that are like circle shapes.
Yep.
Like circle, triangles, and squares.
Yep. So you have the interface as one entity, as one like, it's not exactly a class, but it's like a class, and then you'll have separate implementations that implement that interface. Yes. The question is, if you have something that's writing, why do you have to deal with the I/O exception? The answer is that in Java, you don't have to catch all exceptions, but there's a certain subset of exceptions in Java that you must handle. That's just the way Java is designed. Not every language is like that, but Java has a subset of exceptions that they're like, no, you have to deal with this, and if you don't, we won't compile. So that's a specific thing to Java. Not everybody thinks that's a good idea. It irritates the hell out of me personally, but that's a feature of Java. That's a decision that the designers of Java made when they built the language. Does that answer your question? So it's a language-specific thing in that case. Yes. Can I explain what a recursive method does? Was that the question? Okay. So a recursive method, the most important thing to remember about a recursive method is that it is defined in part by itself. It refers to itself. It has a self-reference. For recursive methods, that means it's going to have a call to itself somewhere in there. So the Fibonacci sequence has base cases, like it has the base cases of the Fibonacci of 0 is 0, the Fibonacci of 1 is 1, and then everything else is defined in terms of itself. So the Fibonacci of some number is equal to the Fibonacci of the 2 previous Fibonacci numbers. And so the only way to get those is to eventually go all the way down and find all the different values. That's what we mean when we say something is recursive. We mean it references itself. It's defined by itself. Okay? Yes, and then to you, I promise. Yes? How do bitwise operators work for base 10 numbers? The answer is they don't work for base 10 numbers. So the first step you have to do is you have to convert a base 10 number into a binary number. Then you can apply the bitwise operators. Then you can convert them back into decimal. Does that answer your question? Unless you have a really good memory and you can memorize those like bitwise tables, but I don't recommend that. Yeah. It was you, right? Yeah.
Must the recursive method have more than one return statement because for the thing you define? So you
the
need
question
a
was,
with a return.
Must a recursive method have more than one return statement? I am fairly certain that you can write recursive methods in a clever way that only has one return statement, but it would have to cover at least one base case. So there's always at least one base case and one recursive case for any recursive method. You could get real clever and have a single return statement, but it would have to cover both cases. So I'm sure I could hack something together that was an example of that. So it's not, the requirement isn't that it has multiple return statements, it's that it has at least two cases, and one of them is a base case and one of them is a recursive case. You can have more than two, but you have to have at least those two. Let's see, I know that, yes sir? What's that? Oh, like why can you use a parent ref? Oh, wait. Cat equals new animal. Sorry. Let's do that in reverse, because I think that's the one that you can actually do, which is like, if you have some interface animal, and you have some implementation of that interface called cat, why is it that you can do animal Jimmy equals new cat? Why can you do that? The answer is that you can do that because it allows you to use the more abstract type when you're building methods and variables and stuff like that. Which you may think, well, I can't think of a case where I would do that. But a lot of this comes from interfaces, and abstract classes are a big part of this. So a lot of times, you know that the object you're going to take in is going to be, it's going to implement some interface. But you might not know anything else about the object. In that case, it is acceptable for you to use the interface type instead of like the more specific type, because you know what else it is, and maybe you don't care. Maybe you're like, I don't care if it's a dog or a cat or a Tyrannosaurus Rex. All I care about is that it's an animal. And if that's all you care about, then that's okay. Yes? What's the difference between import and extends? The import function, what it does is it allows you to use another class. That's all it does. It just allows you to create objects and references of a specific type. The extends actually says, I'm going to take everything that existed in this old object, and I'm going to make a new object, but it's going to have all of those features. So you might import a list, right? Because you want to make a list of values. So you might import java.util.arraylist or whatever. But and maybe it's because I'm doing my Pokedex, right? Let me give you a more concrete example. Let's say I have my Pokedex objects, right? My Pokedex class. I want to have a list of Pokemon in that. I might use a list for that. That doesn't mean my Pokedex is a list. My Pokedex has a list. Whereas if I extend an object, like if I have Pokemon and then I extend Pokemon and create water Pokemon, a water Pokemon is a Pokemon. It doesn't have a Pokemon. So it's that is a versus has a relationship. Does that make sense? Okay, yes?
The other day I was programming and I got an error that said a non-static variable cannot be referenced from a static context, and I was wondering what that
Yes, that's a good question. It's a good question a lot of people are running into. The question is, hey, I ran into this error, and it's probably in your main or something like that, right? And it says, cannot reference non-static method from static context, right? What that means is that you're trying to use an object method without creating an object. So let's say you have a Pokedex, and it has an add Pokemon method. You have to have a Pokedex object in order to add that, because otherwise you're just like, it's like if I'm trying to order food but there's no waiter in the restaurant. Like who can I give instructions to if there's nobody there? I can say, water, give me water, and it doesn't matter if nobody's listening, right? You have to have an object to reference in order to give the command, because methods, remember, are like commands. Static methods are like, we're giving the system a command. But whenever we have a non-static method, that means we need some object to give that message to. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, yes?
For the, kind of really, but do we have to create a new Pokemon object every time they create, the user creates a new Pokemon, or can we use the Pokemon and Pokédex class just as like one object in each?
Okay, yeah. So let me the question is, do I have to create a Pokemon object every time somebody does like add Pokemon? The answer is you could probably find a way to solve the problem without doing that. Although, man, that would be a lot of work, and all the methods are still going to have to work. So if we test things and they don't work, then it's not going to give you a good grade. So I think, could you code around it? You might be able to. I wouldn't recommend it though. My recommendation would be to create the objects.
Could you maybe like help enlighten us on, enlighten me at least, on how to create a new like specific object based on user input? Because
Sure.
Yeah.
So like we have these constructors, right? So our constructors allow us to create new objects. So let's say that we wanted to create we have a Pokemon name and we want to create a new Pokemon object from that. I would probably want a constructor that takes in the Pokemon name. That's the first step. I probably want a constructor that takes in the Pokemon name, that takes a string name, right? And in my code where I'm creating the Pokemon, I do like something equals new Pokemon, and then I put the name variable in the parentheses. And then my Pokemon class, I need to have a constructor, like with the name Pokemon and then the parentheses, that takes in a string and assigns the name and the values and stuff like that. So basically, you need to use the new keyword, and then inside of your Pokemon class, you have to have a constructor that actually takes that information and uses it. So, like that's the starting point. So, hopefully that'll get you moving in the right direction. Okay, let's see who's next. Yes. What? So, what's the difference between a wholly abstract class with wholly abstract methods and an interface? The biggest difference, probably the most salient, is that you can only inherit from one abstract class, but you can implement multiple interfaces. There's not a huge difference between them. The differences are subtle. They're tiny. So, the abstract classes are older and they're slightly less functional. That's the biggest difference. Yes. Can I explain polymorphism? You got a couple of hours? Yeah, so polymorphism is, the idea of polymorphism is, if you break up the words, maybe this makes it a little easier to remember. Poly meaning many, morph meaning form, right? So it means that you can have one method that has the same name, same attributes, same signature, many forms. So you might have a parent class, and it has an implementation of the attack method. And then you might have a child of that class, right? So I might have like a character class. And then I might extend that character class with a monster class. And that monster class might also have an attack method. And it might have the same signature, but it has different code in it. That's polymorphism. We have one name and many forms for that name. Does that make sense? Yep. Yes. Oh, good question. How do I make Java select the version of the method that I want to use? The default is it will always use the lowest level one. If you want to use a higher level one, that's what the super keyword is for. Yep. Yeah, super. Okay. Who's next? Anybody? We're gonna finish like 10 minutes early. Yes.
Can you explain when you override a method?
Yeah. So the question is, what happens when you override? These are all really good questions, by the way. Thank you for coming with good questions prepared. When you say that you want to override a method, what that means is that there is a method that already exists, and you're replacing the implementation of it. So when we talk about polymorphism, overriding is a type of polymorphism. So if you have a child class, it could just use its parent's implementation of a method. Or it could override that method and create a new form, a new version of that method that's different and unique for this child class. That's what overriding is.
So, but would you use, I guess, say like override when it comes to like with interface? Like how it's very signature, or like that's very having like its own
I think for an interface, you would say that you're implementing the interface method. It's only when you're replacing something that you would say you're overriding.
So overriding means like abstract, so that's more like
yeah. it's usually when you're extending a class that you would say that you're overriding a function. I thought I saw, yes?
Do you have to use all the methods in the interface?
You have to use all the methods in the interface. You definitely, anything that is not defined for you, you must implement it in interface. Absolutely. So the only exception to this is like there's the default method. If you have a keyword default method in the interface, then you don't have to implement that. You automatically get that. But anything else you have to implement from interface. Yeah. Yes? Can there only be one default method? There can only be one. It's like Highlander. No, you can have multiple default methods. They have to have different signatures, different names. But yeah, you can have multiple ones. When I was a kid, I watched the Highlander TV series that I watched. I don't know if anybody else watched that. Let's see, yes. And I'll get yours next, okay? Okay, so local classes, private classes, and inner classes. So let's address these separately. A local class is a class that exists only and exclusively inside of a method. That's what a local class is. It means I define the class inside of a method, I use it inside of that method, and after that method ends, it disappears. That's a local class. A private class is a type of nested class that's private. It can only be used from inside of that class. It's an organizational technique. An inner class is one of two types of static classes. Of nested classes. We have static nested classes, which are not tied to an object, and then we have inner classes, which are tied to an object. So we talked about that briefly before, but yes, yeah, exactly, yep. The main point of private, like we mostly use this as an organizational technique, but it's only used inside of another class. That's what it is. Yes. Yep. Okay, let's see. Were you the one that I said I'd get to? Yes, okay, go ahead. Right, the question was, so we haven't done this yet because it's more advanced technique. There are these things in Java called annotation. So if you've seen like the @override thing, that's what that is. It's called an annotation. You do not have to do that to override a method. That's there to add extra checks for the compiler to help you. We haven't talked about them yet because they're a really advanced concept. You don't have to have them, but you will see them because a lot of people use them.
Okay. And the second question, when you said the abstract class like inherits two things, do you mean like as a chain, like you can't have an abstract class and inherit another abstract?
No. So the question was, when I say that you can only inherit from one, when you're inheriting, you can only inherit from one class, and that includes abstract classes. I just mean at the same time. So you can inherit from an abstract class, and then somebody else can inherit from you, and they're inheriting from both, right? But you can't have, what you can't have is two parents, basically. So that's the limitation. And interfaces do not have that limitation. That's what makes them significantly powerful. You're very welcome. Let's see, is there anybody I haven't hit yet that really wants to ask a question? I want to make, yes? Right, you can only inherit from one abstract class at a time. All right, I'll take yours. I just want to make sure everybody else has had a chance. So, yes, I'll take yours and then yours. Yes? Yeah.
What's the difference between protected and private?
Oh, that's a really good question. What's the difference between protected and private? Well, let's step all the way back just so I cover them all. Public means anybody can get to it. That's pretty easy. Then we have the default permissions in Java, which is if you don't put public or protected or private or anything, the default in Java is what's called package protected, which means that's, I won't ask you that on my quiz. I won't ask you to regurgitate that. But what it means is that only other classes inside of that package can access that. Protected means if you use the protected keyword, anyone in the package or any derived class can access it. In principle, it's mostly used for derived classes. Like a child class can access protected, but not private elements. And private things can only be accessed inside of that 'that class, not inside of any derived classes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes?
I was saying, can you go over enumerations real quick and then when you would want to use them?
Sure, enumeration. So an enumeration is a special type of class in Java. It's a special type of class with a limited number of possible values. So in an enumeration, you can define a list of values, and those are the only values that enumeration or a reference to that enumeration can hold. That's the main and most valuable part of it. So let's say that you wanted to represent, let's say you didn't want to have a derived class for the types of Pokemon. Instead, you wanted to say, okay, that's overkill, I don't need another class, I'm just going to have a variable called type inside of each Pokemon, and that'll hold the type. Then you could have an enumeration of the types, and the enumeration could be water, fire, earth, wind, stuff like that, right? So that's the value of an enumeration, is it lets you have a set of distinct, discrete values, and that's the only thing that it can hold. So you can do the same thing with numbers, but it's not as clean and not as readable. That's the big benefit of enumerations. Is a lot of these techniques are organizational and conceptual. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes?
When you were talking about when it comes to default and interface, but what's the difference between like the default and the other one? I thought when interface they're supposed to have those methods.
Yeah, so what's the difference between if you have like the default keyword and if you don't? Is that the question? If you have the default keyword, you have to have an actual method there. You can't just have the signature. So in an abstract class, if you have the default keyword, you have to give the method in the interface itself. And that means people get it automatically when they inherit from it. Whereas everything else, it's just a signature. It just has the return type and the variable types. So the person has to implement everything else. So they're kind of like opposites. Like default is saying, this is the one thing, or the one of a small number of things, that I'm actually going to give to people who inherit from the class. Whereas if you just have the line, like most stuff in an interface is just a line and a semicolon, right? If that's what you have, that means you guys got to provide it. So
instance, like you must have the signature, but you do whatever you want inside the code.
Yes.
Code box. But then the default one's one that you give your own unique.
Yeah, you give it to them. Now they can override it, but you give one to start.
When it comes, because I don't understand that with interface you can't use like characteristics in sense like attack, like for example, Pokemon like attack, speed, or anything. With a default, could you do that or no? So like overall interface you can't give like default values.
The only defaults you can give in an interface are default methods. It's just methods, yep. Okay, we're almost out of time, just so you know, we have 7 minutes. I'm going to keep taking questions all the way up until the bell goes. I'm going to take yours and then yours. Yes? So the question is it going to be more conceptual or more blocks of code? My goal is always, I'll tell you my motivation in building the test, and hopefully this works. My motivation is always to be conceptual. With that said, sometimes to test concepts, we have to have blocks of code. So, with the goal of even those blocks of code questions, I explicitly pore over the code and try to avoid gotcha questions for code especially. Like I don't like them. Like I don't like to give them, and I don't think that they test people effectively. So my goal is always to write stuff conceptually, but sometimes we have to use code for that. That doesn't mean I'm perfect at it, and sometimes we make mistakes, but that's kind of the goal. That's what I'm going for. I believe that if it is always my goal, and I believe that if you know the concepts, you should be in good shape going into the exam. We're not testing your coding ability in the exam. We are testing your tracing ability. Like you have to be able to trace code. You have to understand sequencing and stuff like that. But we're not trying to test your syntax knowledge. Yes?
I wish it was the other way.
The question is, if you use the super keyword twice to access something that's in a grandparent. So I'll start by saying, I promise not to give you that on an exam, but I'm pretty sure it's true and I haven't tested it. But it won't, that particular thing won't be on an exam.
It's true.
I'm pretty sure you can do that.
It's true. It's not true.
Yes.
Java explicitly does not allow you to access the parent.
Java, okay, so we have the answer. Java explicitly does not allow you to do that, apparently. So, weird. I wonder why. Oh, I guess it doesn't matter. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Now I know that for future reference. Anyone else? Just wave your hand, flail your hand if you need my attention. Oh, yes, yes. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you say it one more time? Oh my God. So I heard, what happens if you try to make a class and then read blah, 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 blah. Which I know is not your fault. It's because I can't hear. Can everybody be quiet for me, please? Constructed. Oh, if you don't give a class a constructor. Okay, I understand. What happens if you have a class but you don't have a constructor in that class? Then Java creates what's called a default constructor, which just assigns default values to everything. So if you don't create a constructor explicitly, then Java will just make one for you. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Do you have to have both an explicit and a default constructor?
No. So the default constructor only, that's something that Java adds automatically if you don't have a constructor. So like as soon as you add a constructor, Java says, okay, I'm not doing anything. So as soon as you add one, it'll only use yours.
So if you create a constructor with parameters, what happens if you call it without parameters?
Oh, that's a great question. What happens if you create a constructor with parameters, but then you try to create an object without passing parameters? Then it'll be a compiler error. So, yes?
For some classes, you feel like a lot of the earlier programs you made, there wasn't actually classes, just a class with a main method in there. What would be the, what am I trying to say? What would be the...
It's okay. If you want to chew on it, you can ask me afterwards too.
Okay.
Anybody? Yes. Will there be any, let me make sure this is what you asked. Are there going to be any questions about the differences between abstract classes and, did you say interfaces? I mean, I definitely think that's fair game. So you should know that so what do you think the most important difference is between interfaces and abstract classes? You can just shout it. You guys can shout it. Okay, well, more than one, right? So for an abstract class, there can be only one, right? Whereas with interfaces, you can have as many as one. That is definitely the most important difference between the two. You should know the little features of them because these concepts will come up in later classes again. But that is easily the most important thing about the difference between abstract classes and interfaces. Yes, did you clear it up in your head?
No, some of the programs we used to write, they only had one class. It was just a class with the main method. What would be the constructor for that class then?
Oh, okay. So the question was, sometimes we only have a main method. We don't have any like constructor or anything. In that case, even though it never gets used, Java does make a default constructor for that object, but we never actually create an object from that class. This is one of those weird quirks about Java. In most languages, you can have just a main method that doesn't exist inside of a class. Like C and C++, actually almost every other language. You can just have a main method. It's actually a main function, and it's not inside of a class. Java's weird because you have to have it inside of a class. So it technically has a constructor that never gets used, and no object is ever created from that class. But that's really a quirk of Java, so I don't want you to get hung up on that.
Okay.
But that's the background.
Okay.
Okay, this is going to be the last one. Yes. And the others of you can come up and ask later. Other classes inherit from interfaces. Yes. So other classes are derived from interfaces. They implement interfaces. Okay, so just real quick, something I want to let you know. Tomorrow, you've probably seen it on Slack if you're on there. Tomorrow there is somebody not affiliated with me, but a student has been kind enough and taken it upon himself, has already been through this class, to offer a review session for you guys for the class. So I hope you'll think about going. I did give him all the materials so that he can go over stuff with you guys as you like. It's a really kind service for them to do. Take a look on Slack if you haven't seen it. I don't remember the exact time, but I know it was posted there. Take care, and I'll see you on Tuesday.